All right, I'm going to start to break into the success criteria along the lines of which group or which area they address. And we'll start with mobile success criteria. Folks who've gone through my accessibility onboarding recently probably remember this slide or maybe familiar with it. And I put it in here again as sort of a lead in to the individual criteria, and also to really emphasize that mobile first design is critical for WCAG 2.1. Checking just this morning, over the last 3 months, 49% of all va.gov traffic on our most trafficked web pages, including our homepage, is now mobile devices. When you take into account tablets and desktop, splitting the remaining 51%, mobile traffic on smartphones and similar sized devices now represents the largest share of our web traffic to va.gov. That number is up from 40% earlier this year and up from 33% as of mid-late 2020. So we've seen a significant growth in mobile traffic, and there does not seem to be any slowdown on the horizon for that. So we encourage teams to do mobile first, and that means starting with your smallest form factor, designing for the mobile screen, and then scaling up for wider screens, for your tablets, for your desktops, for your wide screens. We always say it's much easier to design with the smallest, most real estate restricted space, typically your phones, where you're working in maybe one column, maybe two buttons side by side. It's always easier to expand and take advantage of more real estate on larger devices. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk next about the 5 new individual success criteria for mobile. The first one is orientation, and the short description will be sort of a plain language explanation of what each of these success criteria mean. The key takeaways are the things that we want practice areas on product teams to remember. So for orientation, want to style your website or your application or your feature that it doesn't lock on or require a single display mode. Basically, what happens when users rotate their device? If I'm looking at the page in landscape, with my phone tipped sideways, longer than it is tall, how does it look? If I turn my device and now I'm holding it vertically, it's taller than it is wide, what happens? Does the layout react promptly? Does the layout react smoothly? We want to consider usability for these vertical and horizontal displays. We also want to consider how layouts respond when devices are rotated. Does the layout need to change? Does information need to get reorganized? This is an important first facet. Free flow is the second mobile consideration. And we have already been front running this one a little bit, but there are some additional things we want to really start to hone in on. And that is, we want to ensure users can zoom in on your website without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions. Content shouldn't spill off of the right or the left of your page or your viewport. And it must be easy to read on mobile devices and on browsers that have been zoomed up to 400%. Now, there are some exceptions that we do make allowances for. If you have large data tables or you have large images, it is acceptable for those to scroll in 2 dimensions. However, with that in mind, those exceptions for your tables or for your images shouldn't cause a poor user experience. And those things are very subjective calls, but we do ask teams that if you have a large image that needs to stay large or that simply can't be compressed to fit into a small screen, maybe you have a map that would lose too much fidelity or too much resolution if you scaled it down, that would be a qualifier for a large image. But we also want to make sure that you're taking care of users. Maybe you offer directions in a first, second, third step list or some other way to facilitate the user experience. Pointer gestures are a third mobile consideration. We must provide simple alternatives, and simple alternatives being like single taps versus swipe events for complex motions or gestures on touch screens. The good news is we don't include complex gestures in our website today. I include this because I would like product teams to be aware of this requirement as we work on future items, both web and native. the key takeaways: we want to avoid multi-point gestures, anything that requires more than one finger, say a 3-finger swipe or 2-finger anchor with a 3rd finger to rotate. Those are complex gestures, and we really want to stick to simple gestures, 1 finger, 1 input, to meet our audience where they're at. Pointer cancellation is the next one. We want to provide a way to cancel the event trigger when you click with a mouse, press, or touch with your finger. Now, I'm guilty of this. I like to submit forms before I'm ready. So I'll get to the submit button and I'll press down on it with my mouse or press down on the space bar and realize, you know what, I wasn't ready to submit that form yet. Or if I'm on a mobile device, I'll be tapping along and working through the form and I'll accidentally hit the submit button. But because I haven't released my finger from the button yet, I can slide my finger off of the button and I can take my finger away from the screen and it won't submit the form. That's the experience we want. We want users to be able to slide away gracefully, take their finger off the screen, take their finger off the mouse, and not have an action be taken. This allows users to abort or undo an action. And one of the things we ask front-end developers, especially, to be on the lookout for is to avoid down events in JavaScript handlers. Motion actuation is our next mobile takeaway. For any functions that are activated by motion, think tilting, shaking, swiping, gesturing toward the phone, we want to provide a simpler alternative means of action. Now, again, we don't do this in our web applications on va.gov today, but it is something we want to watch out for in future apps. And if you do need, or you do include something like a tilt, shake, or a gesture in your experience, we want to make sure we include UI like a button to recreate that gesture. Say, for instance, you allow users to shake their phone back and forth 2 or 3 times to reset a form. Let's also think about handling that with a button press. So shaking is not the only way to reset that form. Next, I'm going to move on to cognitive success criteria. Cognition is very unique. It is a situation where no 2 individuals are alike. We all process in our own ways. And cognitive considerations are a very big part of WCAG 2.1. And some of the considerations include, but are not limited to, cognitive and learning disabilities. These are defined as items that might significantly reduce ability in 1 or more areas of cognitive function that affects learning. This might include communication, reading, writing, or math, and or significantly reduced ability to understand new or complex information and learn new skills, maybe with a reduced ability to cope independently. Neurodiversity refers to the different ways the brain can work and interpret and process information. Traumatic brain injuries, abbreviated as TBI, are damage to the brain which can lead to long-term impairment of executive function, memory, learning, coordination, speech, and emotion. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, abbreviated, is a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying or scary event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. So with those items defined, we're going to talk about the 4 new success criteria for cognition. Identify input purpose is our first one. And this one, the short description: input should be programmatically identifiable for assistive tech and use the autocomplete attribute where they would be beneficial. This is specifically related to form inputs, where an autocomplete attribute like first name, last name, full name, email address, telephone number might be in order. And what this is going to do is autocomplete will allow a form field to be filled in automatically if it recognizes that the person has previously filled in this field. So if I had an input with an autocomplete equals email, and it remembered my personal email address, it being my browser remembered my personal email address, it would fill that field in automatically for me. And this is really helpful for folks who don't want to have to remember or don't want to have to recall or retype information that they have opted into in their browser, and information that's well tread and things that they don't want to have to spend cognitive energy recalling. And this is one of those things that designs should help users understand this is a feature. In Chrome specifically, when an input has autocomplete enabled, the input field turns yellow and text appears in it instantly. And the first time that happened to me, I was very surprised, and it took me a little while to understand that this was a feature. This was by design. We want to make sure that we help users understand that. We also want to think about security and privacy. There is a potential with this app, with this attribute, the autocomplete attribute, for misfiling or misfilling in public situations. Thinking about a library or a VA medical center where inputs have autocomplete enabled. There are ways to turn off the autocomplete in browsers, but that's also our responsibility to make sure we provide administrators good support, saying we have this feature enabled. If you are using this in a public space, here are ways to turn that off. Timeouts. This is the ability to warn users when a period of inactivity, say they stepped away from their browser, could cause data loss. This one we are already doing with our user sessions on va.gov. When a user is logged in, if they have been inactive for 30 minutes, we give them a timeout warning. If that's not possible for something you're doing, an alternative idea might be to preserve data for more than 20 hours. Label and name is inputs with a text label must have an accessible name that contains the visual label. A lot of times we see on our forms, we have visual labels that say something like submit or edit. If you see that, or if you come across that in your daily work, a good question to ask yourself is, submit what? Do I know what I'm submitting? Do I know what I'm editing? An accessible label should answer that question for you without needing to read nearby content, without having to read a paragraph or a heading above it. So a good accessible label might be something like submit your 1010 EZ form. Now that's crystal clear what I am doing. That's also not practical to have a long input label visually available, but there are ways that we can have both clear visual representation with a succinct submit label and also an accessible label that answers that question for assistive technology or users who might not be able to see the page. Status messages, these include our error messages, notices, loading indicators. These should be announced to assistive technology like screen readers without having to receive keyboard focus. Key takeaway here is when you need a loading indicator, if you are processing a form, if you're processing a user submission, if you're waiting for data to load asynchronously, it's good to think about what you would like that loading indicator to say. Pretend you are not able to see the screen, or maybe you aren't able to see the screen, and you ask yourself, given that I'm waiting for something to happen, what would I like to hear? What's going to help me understand what's going on and give me reassurance that the application is working as I expect it to, it just needs a few more moments.